There are moments when a single sentence doesn't just add context. It forces you to abandon the shortcut you've been using to understand an entire conflict. Stephen Kotkin opens with one of those sentences. We can't really put Vladimir Putin in the same sentence with Joseph Stalin. Stalin is a singular figure. His category is very small. Hitler, Mao. That's about it. At first, that line sounds like it's minimizing Putin, but it's doing the opposite. Kotkin is warning that the most common comparison people make is actually blinding them. If you assume Putin is just another Stalin, you miss the real reason this war happened and why so many confident predictions about Russia keep failing. And once you understand why Kotkin draws that line so sharply, the entire conflict in Ukraine starts to look less mysterious and far more structural. Stalin ruled a revolutionary system. He sat atop a state that was expanding, mobilizing, and ideologically convinced that history was on its side. That difference matters more than personality, more than ideology, and more than rhetoric. Putin is surrounded every day by the architecture of empire, by symbols of Russian greatness, by physical reminders of a time when Moscow believed it stood at the center of world history. But symbols are not capable, and the distance between those symbols and Russia's actual capabilities creates a permanent tension at the heart of Russian strategy. This is where Kotkin's argument becomes uncomfortable, because it refuses to let anyone hide behind easy explanations. He rejects the idea that Russia is aggressive because of some timeless cultural instinct. He also rejects the opposite claim, that Russia is merely reacting defensively to Western expansion. Instead, he points to a recurring dilemma that Russian leaders have faced for centuries and keep choosing to resolve in the same way. Russia wants recognition as a great power in a world dominated by Western institutions, finance, technology, and alliances that it does not control. That mismatch produces ambition without the means to fulfill it. Faced with that gap, Russian leaders repeatedly reach for the same tool. It feels decisive. It feels historical. And it feels like proof of relevance. But it never actually solves the underlying problem it's meant to address. Each attempt to impose power through force deepens the very weaknesses Russia is trying to escape. Economic isolation increases. Technological dependence grows. Demographic pressures intensify. Yet the cycle repeats, because backing down would require admitting that the original ambition was unattainable. And that admission is politically and psychologically intolerable for leaders who define themselves through national greatness. This is why the war in Ukraine cannot be understood as a sudden break or a moment of irrational madness. It is the latest expression of a long-standing strategic choice to pursue imperial status in a world where the foundations of that status no longer exist. Once you see that, the familiar arguments about provocation and misunderstanding start to fade. This wasn't an accident. It was a decision rooted in a deep refusal to accept limits and a belief that force could finally close the gap between what Russia wants to be and what it actually is. Once you stop treating Putin as a modern Stalin, the next question becomes unavoidable. If this war isn't driven by ideology, and it isn't the result of some ancient cultural instinct toward violence, then what is actually pushing Russia to behave this way? Kotkin's answer is uncomfortable precisely because it removes the distance people like to keep. This is not a tragedy of misunderstanding, it is a pattern of choice. Kotkin describes this pattern as Russia's perpetual geopolitics. It sounds academic, but the logic is stark. Russia exists in a world where the most important systems of power, finance, technology, global trade, legal norms, and security institutions are dominated by the West. From Moscow's perspective, that creates a permanent imbalance. Russia wants recognition and influence on the level of the great powers, but it lacks the structural capacity to compete on the terms that now define global strength. This is where many popular explanations collapse. Some argue Russia is lashing out because it feels encircled. Others insist NATO expansion left Putin with no alternative. Kotkin rejects both arguments. He insists that Russia is not being forced into confrontation. It is choosing it. This is not a story of eternal Russian aggression, he explains. It's a strategic choice to try to match the power of the West, which from Russia's vantage point is actually unmatchable. That sentence reframes the entire conflict. If the goal itself is unattainable, then every attempt to reach it through force is guaranteed to fail in the long run. But the alternative, accepting limits, is politically unbearable. Accepting the Western-led order would mean playing by rules Russia did not write, inside institutions it does not control, while acknowledging that its economic and technological base lags behind. For a leadership that ties legitimacy to national greatness, that feels less like compromise and more like surrender. So instead, Russia repeatedly turns to the one domain where it still believes it can compensate for weakness: military power. Force becomes a shortcut, a way to assert relevance without fixing the underlying problems of the state. Tanks and missiles create the appearance of strength even as institutions hollow out and long-term capacity erodes. The irony, Kotkin argues, is that this strategy worsens the very condition it's meant to solve. Each use of force deepens isolation. Sanctions tighten dependence on foreign technology. War accelerates population loss and capital flight. The gap between ambition and capability widens. Yet the leadership persists, because reversing course would require admitting that the entire project was misguided from the start. This is where psychology matters as much as strategy. Many of the people surrounding Putin experienced the collapse of the Soviet Union not as liberation, but as humiliation. They lost status, certainty, and a sense of historical purpose in a world that moved on without them. That resentment didn't fade with time. It hardened, and eventually it became policy. For leaders operating inside that mindset, restoring greatness isn't about improving governance or building trust-based institutions. It's about reversing a perceived historical loss. When that loss feels existential, other people's lives become abstractions. Economic damage becomes acceptable. Long-term consequences are postponed in favor of immediate symbolic victories. Seen this way, the invasion of Ukraine doesn't look like a sudden miscalculation. It looks grimly consistent. When faced with decline, Russia's leadership does not turn inward to rebuild. It reaches outward to coerce, not because it works, but because it feels decisive. And in a system where legitimacy is tied to the projection of strength, action, even destructive action, can feel safer than restraint. If Russia's behavior is a choice rather than a reflex, then the argument people keep returning to needs to be confronted directly. The claim sounds familiar. Putin didn't want this war, but NATO expansion left him with no alternative. Push a country far enough, the logic goes, and eventually it lashes out. It feels reasonable, it spreads responsibility, and it turns aggression into something almost mechanical. Kotkin rejects that framing outright, because it treats violence as something that simply happens when pressure builds. Wars don't begin when options disappear. They begin when leaders decide that violence is preferable to restraint. NATO did not remove Russia's agency in 2022. The decision to invade Ukraine was made, not forced. Kotkin's counterargument is intentionally blunt, because he believes clarity matters more than comfort. The mere fact that the West is stronger than Russia is not a crime on the part of the West. Power itself is not provocation. Countries choosing to align with stronger institutions is not coercion. It is choice. And when states on Russia's borders seek security outside Moscow's orbit, that reflects their own history and fears, not some Western plot. This framing matters because it restores responsibility. If NATO expansion explains everything, then Putin becomes a reactor, not an actor. But once you acknowledge that Russia chose confrontation with an order it dislikes, the burden shifts back to the leadership that believed force would succeed where reform had failed. When actions carry costs but no existential penalty, they stop feeling risky. Violence normalizes itself. The calculation quietly shifts from whether something is acceptable to whether it is effective. And in that mindset, human suffering no longer functions as a break. Lives become abstractions. Destruction becomes a line item. This is the cold logic of imperial thinking. The objective is not stability or peace, but stature. National greatness is elevated above individual existence, and sacrifice becomes acceptable as long as it belongs to others. War is justified not because it is moral, but because it is framed as necessary for restoring historical standing. That worldview explains why warnings about economic damage or civilian casualties fail to deter escalation. Those costs are not denied. They are discounted. When leaders believe they are correcting a civilizational imbalance, suffering becomes tolerable, even useful. It reinforces the narrative of struggle against a hostile world. But wars of choice also depend on miscalculation. They require the belief that resistance will be weak, alliances will fracture, and consequences will remain manageable. In Ukraine, nearly every one of those assumptions collapsed at once. The Kremlin expected speed. It expected confusion. It expected a leadership that would flee or fold. Instead, it encountered a society willing to resist, a president who stayed, and a war that refused to follow the familiar script of previous interventions. The invasion of Ukraine was not inevitable. It was learned behavior turned into policy. It was a decision shaped by past impunity and false confidence. And once it began, it exposed the limits of coercion far faster than its architects anticipated. In the next part, those limits become impossible to ignore, because the war Putin believed he could control becomes something else entirely, defined not by Moscow's intentions, but by Ukraine's response. What ultimately breaks the logic of this war is not sanctions, speeches, or even battlefield maps. It's Ukraine. More specifically, it's the thing the Kremlin consistently failed to model, a society that would refuse to collapse on schedule. Russia planned for speed, confusion, and resignation. What it encountered instead was cohesion, improvisation, and resolve. Before the invasion, Ukraine was not a heroic ideal. It was corrupt, messy, and politically volatile. Its president was a former television comedian with low approval ratings. And they don't predict what happens when a leader chooses visibility over safety. Zelensky didn't win this war with speeches alone. He changed its trajectory by staying. By making himself visible. By turning the invasion into a story the world could not ignore. Ukraine didn't just fight on the ground. It fought in the information space, where legitimacy matters as much as territory. For years, Russian and Chinese strategists operated under the assumption that the liberal order was hollow, fractured, and exhausted. That the future belonged to a multipolar world where Western influence would fade naturally. This matters because it exposes the final miscalculation behind the war. Russia was not just fighting Ukraine. It was challenging a system it believed was already in retreat. What it discovered instead was that the system still works when confronted directly. And that confrontation carries risks Russia cannot easily control. History does not move according to moral arcs or inevitable outcomes. It moves through choices, misjudgments, and moments when people refuse to behave as expected. The invasion of Ukraine was built on a series of assumptions about weakness, fear, and inevitability. What broke those assumptions was not Western rhetoric, but human agency. Understanding that doesn't guarantee a peaceful future, but it does strip away the excuses that make wars easier to start. And if there is any lesson worth holding on to here, it's this. Conflicts like this are not caused by fate. They are caused by decisions. And they end, eventually, the same way, when reality finally overrides illusion.